Good evening. Buenas tardes. I'm Charlie Hale. I'm Director of Lilas Benson Latin American Studies and Collections here at the University of Texas. And it's my distinct privilege to be the first to welcome you to the Flair Symposium, which marks the opening of the Garcia Marquez Archives at the Harry Ransom Center on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin. Let me begin by extending a special welcome to Mercedes Barcha, her sons Rodrigo and Gonzalo Garcia, and to a large number of family members and friends who honor us with your presence here this evening. Que siempre sean bienvenidos como amigos queridos de nuestra universidad. Quisiera también reconocer la presencia en este evento de Mariana Garcés Córdoba, Ministra de Cultura del Gobierno de Colombia, de Consuelo Gaitán, Directora de la Biblioteca.
The Director of the National Library, Rafael López Méndez, the Consul General of Colombia in Houston, and Gonzalo Gallegos, el Subsecretario del Hemisferio Occidental del Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos. And I would also like to give a heartfelt welcome to Elena Peña Tosca, who will give the final speech Friday afternoon. We have also invited Juan Manuel Santos, the President of Colombia. He wasn't able to come, but he did send a brief greeting, and he has asked that Dr. Gaitán read it. Good evening. This is the message of the President Juan Manuel Santos given the opening of the Literary Archives of Gabriel García Márquez. I will be brief because I know that today belongs to the academicians and the publishers, those who study the work of our noble laureate, and of course, Salman Rushdie, an incredible author who one day Gabo, in a letter that is found in the archives, invited to have a full and unfettered conversation. My dear Salman, given that you're here, let me tell you that just as we were all bathed by that unforgettable rain that lasted 4 years, 11 months, and 2 days, I am convinced that those who had the good fortune to experience those 2 years, 8 months, and 20 years of the age of strangeness will never forget that experience. Thank you for still marveling us with your pen. Today, Colombia is about to put behind it half a century of internal armed conflict, and more than anything, we now value our memories. We remember our history, our dead, our victims, our reconciliation, our truth. Better said, the truth of all of our truths. And in that sense, we are marveled by the unveiling of other memories, the artistic memory, the documentary, the life memories of he who has been the greatest Colombian of the last few years, our beloved Nobel laureate, Gabriel García Márquez. And this is now available for investigation and by research, not only by academicians, but by the general public in one of the best equipped institutions to host and care for these archives, the University of Texas. I can almost hear Gabo saying, better a mausoleum, a literary mausoleum, than to be laid to rest next to Borges and Joyce. There's a reason Mercedes Santos, who I now wish to greet with great warmth, chose this incredible academic center to house this incredible. As a Colombian and as one of the millions of readers of Golobo, I am thankful to all of those who worked so hard for this day to come. Just as the famous trunks of Pessoa keep revealing new surprises, I'm sure that the letters, the speeches, the newspaper cuttings, the albums, and the books that make up this archive will marvel us for years to come. When he died, I remember having said that Gabo, for Colombians, did not invent the magic realism, but he was the best exponent of a country that, in and of itself, is a magic realism. It's a country that combines better than any other joy and pain, ideals and conflict. It's a country where everything is possible, everything including even life, as I affirmed back then. But as a time draws near that we will sign our peace treaty in Havana, I'm inclined to pick up that short-faced case and state clearly and simply that Colombia, my country, Gabo's country, is a nation where everything is possible. Everything. Wherever he is, as he watches over us at this time, I know he's smiling upon me and upon all of you. Signed by Juan Manuel Santos, President of the Republic. Thank you very much. Todos estamos sumamente.
Staff who've worked so hard to make this symposium and its corollary activities possible. This collective effort begun well over a year ago and beyond the call of duty for so many, gives testimony to the grandeur of the legacy that we're all here tonight to engage. This gathering is historic first and foremost because it marks the opening of an archive that will provide scholars the opportunity to explore in novel and challenging ways a literary genius of monumental global stature, a man of letters who also played vital roles as public intellectual, voice of political conscience, impresario of cinema, journalism, culture, and the arts for the common good. It's historic for the extraordinary convergence of scholarly expertise that will be on display over the next 2 days as we set in motion this new phase of research and interpretive endeavors. And it's historic for its role in sealing the reputations of two jewels of this great university, the Harry Ransom Center as unparalleled repository of literary and artistic giants of contemporary times, Lilas Benson Latin American Studies and Collections as convergence of human and material resources for the study of Latin America that has no equal in this land. Thanks to the Garcia Márquez Archive, these two institutions have the chance to work closely together like never before. Para cerrar, quisiera dirigirme de manera especial a todos los latinoamericanos que nos acompañan esta noche. Cuando Steve Ennis, director del Harry Ransom Center, se me acercó para hablar de la posible adquisición de este fabuloso archivo y me propuso trabajar juntos en el proyecto, supe de inmediato que debía responder afirmativamente y que al aceptar asumiríamos un desafío.
Accepted this challenge, it would be a great challenge. People would question us. Why the U.S.? Even more so, why Texas? Perhaps you may have noted and noticed this, that given some of the policies of our state government, I don't want to talk about those. But I do want to indicate that the man who we honor here would totally disapprove of our state's policies. But what I would like to note is the counterpoint, the clear and convincing counterpoint that are held by our university, and specifically by those institutions that have assumed that solemn responsibility of hosting and caring for this archive. We have a clear and simple message for you. There is no other respectable Latin American center if we don't have Latin Americans with us. We have to collaborate. We have to initiate new efforts that share our mutual interests, that are undertaken and worked on jointly, working horizontally and benefiting all of us. We apply these principles to the archives as to all of our teachings and all of our research. We dedicate ourselves to fulfilling these principles. And in a united voice, we wish that this would be the example for all other relations that may exist with Latin America, because unfortunately, this is not our reality. This huge challenge, we find ourselves gladdened by knowing that we count with the spirit of Gabo. He guides us and he reminds us that to stop every little bit, we should narrate and talk about our results. Y ahora, es un gran honor
Introduce our president, Gregory L. Fenves. Last June, President Fenves assumed the leadership of our university as a proven administrator, an award-winning engineer, known for dedication to excellence throughout his career as a teacher, a scholar, and a practitioner. From day one, Greg has shown decisive and visionary leadership and extraordinary energy and drive toward our collective goal of making UT Austin the top public university in the nation. In his inauguration speech earlier this semester, President Fenves confirmed the conviction that a first-class university must have global reach. In that spirit, he's demonstrated a commitment to strengthen ties between UT Austin and Latin America and increased opportunities for students to learn through research and interdisciplinary work within the university and especially across borders. As provost and as president, Greg has shown great support and enthusiasm for the Garcia Márquez archival initiative, for which we can all thank him warmly tonight. Please join me in welcoming President Greg Fenves to the podium. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Dr. Hale, for that wonderful introduction. On behalf of the entire UT community, let me welcome everyone here, our students, faculty, many of our staff, and friends around the community to a great evening for the University of Texas as we celebrate the opening of the Flair Symposium, Garcia Márquez, His Life and Legacy. I'm very proud of the collaboration between three great institutions here at the University of Texas, the Harry Ransom Center, the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, and the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Studies and Collections. I want to congratulate Steve Ennis and Charlie Hale especially and their teams for putting this symposium together. Tonight we are celebrating two giants of literature, Gabriel García Márquez and Salman Rushdie. I want to offer a special welcome to Gabriel's wife, Mercedes, and sons Rodrigo and Gonzalo. Thank you for being with us tonight. And Mr. Rushdie, who we'll introduce in just a few moments, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. It is a momentous occasion for the University of Texas and a great honor for us to have you on our campus. Gabriel García Márquez once wrote, "What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it." By opening the García Márquez papers to the public, we enhance our collective memory of a globally important novelist and a profoundly influential public intellectual. And now the researchers and students and faculty at UT and researchers around the world will have access to materials that will stimulate original scholarship and inspire innovative teaching for our students. The archive will provide a deeper insight into García Márquez's works and the creative process that transferred his rich imagination to the page and helped all of us understand our world much better. And here at UT Austin, besides the papers of Jorge Luis Borges, William Faulkner, and James Joyce, Garcia Marquez's work now invites scholars to think more deeply about the author, his methods, and his wisdom. While fans have been reading between the lines of his novels figuratively for many decades, scholars now can literally read between the lines of the manuscripts. And through the annotations and the edits in his own hand, a researcher and scholar can gain new insight into his genius. In more than 75 boxes of documents that span 60 years, researchers will now have access to drafts of manuscripts, unpublished works, correspondence, 43 photo albums, 22 scrapbooks, research material, notebooks, newspaper clippings, screenplays, and ephemera. Our campus is the perfect home for the Garcia Marquez papers, not only because of the Ransom Center, which provides rich opportunities and fellowships and digital access, but also because UT is a longtime leader in Latin American studies. As the flagship University of Texas that shares the longest border with Latin America and the US, and of a state that shares a deep history with Latin America, we have an obligation to advance the understanding of our shared life. The archive will leverage an array of university strengths represented in the Ransom Center, Lilas Benson, and our leading scholars on campus. Our collections are an important part of our identity as a leading research university in the world. I am thrilled that now the Garcia Marquez Archive offers another avenue for the university to serve our global community. Thank you again for being here on this important night, and enjoy the program.
My name is Steve Ennis. I'm director of the Harry Ransom Center, and it's a great delight to add my words of welcome to those you've already just heard. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's life story reads something like a series of wondrous incidents we encounter in his own novels. The stories that sprang from his imagination lifted him up and carried him the world over, far beyond his native Colombia and beyond his adopted home of Mexico. It is fitting that we open this symposium this evening with an address by one equally well-traveled, by one whose novels perform a similar alchemy. It's a pleasure and honor to welcome Salman Rushdie to the University of Texas to open this year's Flair Symposium on Gabriel Garcia Marquez, his life and legacy. The biennial Flair Symposium is generously supported by an endowment established by Fleur Coles and celebrates creativity and the arts in the tradition of the cultural magazine Flair, which Fleur founded in 1915. Through that bequest, her love of literature and the arts continues to be supported in ways she would surely approve of and delight in. In addition to the Fleur Coles Endowment, I want to acknowledge as well the generous financial support from Lilas Benson, Latin American Studies and Collections, from Suzanne Deal Booth, IBC Bank, and Alfred A. Knopf Publishers. We gather here tonight to hear one of our most accomplished writers speak about another. And this occasion is a reminder that the rich literary tradition we celebrate is larger than the singular artist. We gather this evening to celebrate a literary tradition still in the process of becoming, a tradition still growing and extending its reach in the world. There is, in fact, a creative DNA that runs through the university's research collections, a creative DNA that Garcia Marquez himself would have recognized. When asked about his own literary antecedents, he would name Dickens, Kafka, and Faulkner, skipping freely across nations, languages, and cultures. If Garcia Marquez opened a door on Latin America for many English language readers, myself included, one could say much the same about Salman Rushdie and India. Whether we come from north or south, east or west, we gather here to celebrate the protean flight of the imagination. Salman Rushdie is the author of 10 novels, as well as short stories and books for children, and numerous essays and reviews. In one original and compelling novel after another, he's given us fables for our time that confront the power of history and myth, the power of story to shape our present world. As with Garcia Marquez, the origin often lies in childhood. Garcia Marquez traced his origin as a writer to the memory of his grandmother's stories, while Salman Rushdie has embraced the imaginative possibilities of the Arabian Nights. Both writers found their fictional worlds shaped by strong political forces, whether it be the colonial legacy in South America or on the Indian subcontinent. And both found highly original forms to explore that violent history and its meaning in the present. Midnight's Children has been universally recognized as one of the 20th century's most important novels, and I can't help but wonder if it could have been written without the example of Gabriel García Márquez. Due to his own peculiar experience following the publication of the Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie found himself with nearly a unique vantage point on our world's cultural conflicts. Of necessity, he has become one of our most articulate writers on the persistent conflict between fundamentalism and secularism, a theme he continues to explore in his most recent novel, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights. Both writers have created fictional worlds in which the particular has been made universal, and in that recognition taught us something of the forces shaping our still evolving story. It is this power and achievement which we gather to acknowledge and honor tonight. Please join me in welcoming Salman Rushdie.
Thank you. Thank you. How nice it is to be here with so many of you to celebrate this great writer. When I published my first and now justly obscure novel, Grimus, a friend of mine read it, called me in London and said, "You've obviously been deeply influenced by Gabriel García Márquez." The year was 1975, and I was 27 years old, and I had never heard that name before. The English edition of 100 Years of Solitude, translated by Gregory Rabassa, had been published 5 years earlier, 3 years after the original Spanish edition, but it had not crossed my path. "Who is Gabriel García Márquez?" I asked my friend, and he looked at me with a mixture of disbelief, pity, and contempt. "He is the author of a book you are going to go out and buy right now," he told me. "Today, this afternoon, at once." He told me the book's title, and I replied dubiously, "Really? 100 years of solitude? That's a good book?" "Don't be a moron," my friend said, only he used a ruder word. "Just go and get it." For some reason, I meekly did as he said. In a London bookstore, I found the Penguin Modern Classics paperback edition with its grey jacket, and on the cover, a detail from J.C. Orozco's mural, The Misery of the Peasants. This was dispiriting. not only was I going to have to sit through an entire century of solitude, but in that interminable isolation, I would have to be told about miserable peasants. I opened the book right there in the bookstore, frankly expecting to encounter an insufferable tedium. And for the first time, I saw and seemed to hear these now world-famous words. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. At that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses built on the bank of a river of clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous, like prehistoric eggs. The world was so recent that many things lacked names, and in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point. I wrote the date on which I bought the book on the first page below the author's biodata, and so I know for sure that this happened on March the 13th, 1975, the same month in which my first novel was published. I still have that copy, though I have since bought many others to keep and to give away. Because, of course, what happened to me that day is what happened to millions of people when they read those words. I fell deeply in love, and that love has lasted now for 40 years without diminishing in the least. These peasants were anything but miserable. And the title on the jacket, which had at first seemed so forbidding to me, now seemed like a promise of long delight, a promise which the pages that followed would amply fulfill. I knew almost nothing about the Latin American literary world I had entered, nor of the reality from which it sprang. At the moment of that first encounter, I didn't care. I responded with the simple openness, the happy innocence of the reader, appalled and illumined by the beauty and comedy of the text. The children would remember for the rest of their lives the august solemnity with which their father, devastated by his prolonged vigil and by the wrath of his imagination, revealed his discovery to them. The earth is round like an orange. Ursula lost her patience. If you have to go crazy, please go crazy all by yourself, she shouted. But don't try to put your gypsy ideas into the heads of the children. The comedy of the moment prefigures what will become a trademark of the novel's brand of magic realism, which was present even in the famous first sentence about the miracle of the ice. In Macondo, it is the world of technology and science that feels marvelous, that is to say, unreal, while the village realities of superstition and faith seem natural and therefore true. An ice machine is magical. The discoveries of science are crazinesses. The scholar gypsy Melquiades, whose mother tongue we learn almost at the very end of the novel, was Sanskrit, a revelation which contains perhaps the author's homage to the wonder tales of the East, is received in Macondo as a kind of ragged sorcerer king able to transcend most earthly norms, death included. And the arrival of the first railway train drives at least one woman mad with fear. "It's coming," she cries, "something frightful like a kitchen dragging a village behind it." Nor is this vision of technology as essentially surreal limited to the village. In the Autumn of the Patriarch, the power of American know-how results in the literal loss of the Caribbean. After the dictator, the patriarch, sells the Caribbean to the Americans ambassador's nautical engineers carried it off in numbered pieces to plant it far from the hurricanes in the blood-red dawns of Arizona. They took it away with everything it had inside, General Sir, with the reflection of our cities, our timid, drowned people, our demented dragons. By contrast, when the pure and saintly Remedios the Beauty achieves transcendence, so that one day when the women are folding sheets, she rises up into the sky and presumably goes all the way to heaven, nobody in Macondo turns a hair. Even the matriarch Ursula, whose practicality and good sense anchored the Buendia dynasty, and the novel itself as well, even Ursula accepts the miraculous nature of the event, and so Remedios is lost without argument in the upper atmosphere where not even the highest flying birds of memory could reach her. Outsiders, we are told, disbelieved the tale of levitation, but in Macondo, most people believed in the miracle, and they even lighted candles and celebrated novenas. What we have here is something extraordinary. The creation, by a reversal of the expectations of the modern world, of a tone of voice which nobody in the long history of literature had quite found before. It owes something to many people, of course. No writer is entirely sui generis. Even Shakespeare got Lear and Macbeth from Holinshed's Chronicles, and Hamlet from Saxo Grammaticus's History of the Danes, and who knows what he owed to Thomas Kyd's Lost Hamlet that came before his own. So also in Garcia Marquez, we see traces of the great writers from whom he learned. We see Faulkner's Yochlapatofa somewhere in the neighborhood of Macondo, and Juan Rulfo's Comala is in the near vicinity also. And the town loomed over by Kafka's castle is there too, as also is Kafka's use of metamorphosis, which in his turn Kafka derived from Ovid's Metamorphoses and Apuleius's Golden Ass. We can see traces of Machado de Asis's Bras Cubas and Dom Casmurro in the many Jose Arcadios and Aurelianos and Arcadios and Aureliano Joses of the Buendia dynasty. Machado's anti-melancholy plaster could easily have migrated into Ursula Iguaran's medicine cabinet. And Bras Cubas's useful trick of narrating his story from beyond the grave by a process too complex and tedious to describe could have been learned from Melquiades, or the other way around. And of course, parenthetically, the golden-hearted and melancholy whore is one of the most beloved and recurring character types of Latin American literature. If I may be permitted to introduce one discordant note, I am reminded that the great British fabulist and feminist Angela Carter, a great admirer of Garcia Marquez, used to say wistfully but sharply that she wished that just one of Garcia Marquez's glorious prostitutes was shrewish by temperament and looked like a wall-eyed goat. It is in the nature of literary criticism to seek to place a great writer in the context of his own literature, in the context of the times in which he lived and worked, and in the case of the greatest, in the context of world literature too. And in a minute, I want to discuss the links between magic realism and other literature from other lands that also moves beyond the borders of naturalism. But to do this is not to diminish the singularity of the artist. And the singularity of Garcia Marquez lies, I believe, in the precise note he strikes, a note somewhere on the scale between sweetness and bitterness, between a gentle acceptance of one's fate and an anger about it, the wrath of the imagination, he calls it, from which note proceeds the music of solitude, of human beings locked alone in destinies they cannot escape, moving towards deaths foretold. The power of this music, with its unique tone, has proved both great and enduring, its influence widely pervasive. I've quoted in the past, but I'll quote here again, the joke Carlos Fuentes once made to me. I have the feeling, Fuentes said, that writers in Latin America can't use the word solitude anymore because they worry that people will think it's a reference to Gabo. And I'm afraid, he added mischievously, that soon we will not be able to use the phrase 100 years either. I'm reminded of something Garcia Marquez's fellow Nobel laureate, the great German writer Heinrich Böll, once said about humor. The Latin word humor, Böll reminded us, means dampness. And he recommended a way of writing, a way of seeing, that used a human eye, quotes, that normally is not quite wet and not quite dry, but damp, which is to say, humorous. Böll was describing the manner in which he and his post-war German contemporaries were trying to rebuild German literature from the rubble left behind by Nazism. But the eye of which he speaks, neither sentimentally wet nor cynically dry, but damp, has something to do with Garcia Marquez's way of seeing as well. At the time of that long ago first reading of 100 Years of Solitude, I responded to its story as pure story, to its characters simply as characters in a book. My interest in the world from which it sprang came later. we live in one of the great ages of literary translation, thanks to which the world's literatures arrive in our backyard, speaking our languages, giving us the feeling that they belong to us too, and not only to the soil from which they grew. Any discussion of the global impact of the writing of Gabriel García Márquez must also include a salute to his translators. I remember meeting once long ago the translator Gregory Rabassa, who told me that García Márquez had once said publicly that he considered Rabassa's English version to be superior to the Spanish original. This is probably not true. But the generosity of the remark touched the great translator deeply, and he told the story, probably not for the first or last time, with immense pride. It is a great translation which gives the reader the impression of perfect transparency. It makes one feel one is experiencing the full beauty of the original. Rabassa's version of The Autumn of the Patriarch, a work whose immensely complex and convoluted sentences make it an even greater challenge than the limpid clarity and straight-faced comedy of 100 Years of Solitude, is perhaps an even greater achievement. To see how translation can either illuminate or damage the original text, one need only compare the recent, largely dreadful retranslations of the work of Borges to the previous versions. To take just one example, Borges' famous story, Funes el Memorioso, uses in its title a word, memorioso, which the author made up, and which was perfectly rendered in the English version as Funes the Memorious, memorious being an invention that exactly captured the feeling of Borges' original. In the new translation, the title has been changed to Funes his memory, which does dreadful damage to the original text. The retranslation of Günter Grass's masterpiece, The Tin Drum, is similarly leaden-footed when compared to Ralph Mannheim's marvelous original. I hope nobody is planning to retranslate any of the books of García Márquez. They will have an army of disgruntled readers to contend with if they do. It is tempting to see the world of translated fiction, translated from whatever language, as a parallel world to our own, a magic realm of otherness in which the self can wander. And I suspect that for many non-Latin American readers of García Márquez, this wonderland illusion may be part of the initial appeal. Something of the same sort happened to my own novel, Midnight's Children, whose first Western readers saw it as a straightforward fantasy, while its Indian readers read it almost as a history book. What happened to me was a little different. For me, that first reading of 100 Years of Solitude opened the door to the Latin American literature world, and thanks to one bookstore and one publisher, I plunged in. The publisher was Avon Books, which in the 1970s issued a remarkable series of the best Latin American books in good English translations. Mario Vargas Llosa's The Green House, Julio Cortázar's Rayuela, Hopscotch, Jorge Amado's Doña Flor and Her Two Husbands, Alejo Carpentier's Explosion in a Cathedral, Manuel Puig's Betrayed by Rita Hayworth, and many more. The series was not widely available in London, where I lived. However, a small independent store in North London, Compendium Books in Chalk Farm, not far from Camden Lock, where you could find all manner of otherworldly stuff, science fiction texts and occultist texts, books that taught you numerology and explored black magic, novels such as the paranoid fantasy Illuminatus, and art books about the mysticism of the spiral. Also specialized in interesting imported editions, and there was just about the whole of the Avon list for me to explore. By the time I had devoured these books, I began to understand that the realism part of magic realism was as important as the magic, to see that these books were this way because the world the writers lived in was this way as well. And so I began to see how great my own affinity was, not only to the books, but to the then never-visited country from which they had traveled to the post-hippie eccentricity of that long-gone bookstore near Camden Lock. We live in an age of invented alternate worlds. Tolkien's Middle-earth, Rowling's Hogwarts, the dystopic universes of the Hunger Games, the places where vampires and zombies prowl. These places are having their day. Yet in spite of the vogue for straightforward fantasy fiction, in the finest of literature's fictional microcosms, there is more truth than fantasy. In William Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha, R.K. Narayan's Malgudi, and yes, the Macondo of Gabriel García Márquez, imagination is used to enrich reality, not escape from it. The wonderful has deep roots in the real, and for that reason is able to use the surreal to create metaphors and images of the real that come to feel more real than reality, more truthful than the truth. This is the trouble with the term magic realism, that when people say or hear it, they're really hearing or saying only half of it, magic, without paying attention to the other half, realism. But if magic realism were just magic, it wouldn't matter. It would be mere whimsy, writing in which, because anything can happen, nothing has affect. It's because the magic in magic realism has deep roots in the real, because it grows out of the real and illuminates it in beautiful and unexpected ways, that it works. Consider the following. As soon as Jose Arcadio closed the bedroom door, the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the house. A trickle of blood came out under the door, crossed the living room, went out into the street, continued on in a straight line across the uneven terraces, went down steps and climbed over curbs, passed along the Street of the Turks, turned a corner to the right and another to the left, made a right angle at the Buendia house, went in under the closed door, crossed through the parlor, hugging the walls so as not to stain the rugs, and came out in the kitchen where Ursula was getting ready to crack 36 eggs to make bread. Holy Mother of God, Ursula shouted. In this famous passage from 100 Years of Solitude, something utterly fantastic is happening. The dead man's blood acquires a purpose, almost a life of its own, and moves methodically through the streets of Macondo until it comes to rest at his mother's feet. The blood's behavior is impossible. Yet the passage reads as truthful. The journey of the blood feels like the journey of the news of his death, from the room where he shot himself to his mother's kitchen, and its arrival at the feet of the matriarch Ursula Iguaran reads as high tragedy. A mother learns that her son is dead. Jose Arcadio's lifeblood can and must go on living until it can bring Ursula the sad news. The real, by the addition of the magical, actually gains in dramatic and emotional force. It becomes more real, not less. Sometimes in these books, more is more. Garcia Marquez has a deep fondness for hyperbole, as can be seen from the passage I just quoted. Ursula was getting ready to crack 36 eggs to make bread. That's a lot of eggs. The same sort of numerical inflation is present in the celebrated description of Colonel Aureliano Buendia. Colonel Aureliano Buendia organized 32 armed uprisings and he lost them all. He had 17 male children by 17 different women, and they were exterminated one after the other on a single night before the oldest one had reached the age of 35. He survived 14 attempts on his life, 73 ambushes, and a firing squad. He lived through a dose of strychnine in his coffee that was enough to kill a horse. Most literary characters would be content with one or maybe two uprisings. A smaller family, fewer wives, and not quite as many assassination attempts, and a more moderate dose of poison to swallow. The characters of Garcia Marquez have to work harder, fight more frequently, marry more often, sire more children, survive more murder attempts, ambushes, and firing squads, and drink more strychnine than ordinary folk. It must be exhausting for them. Reading the works of Garcia Marquez and the other writers I discovered at Compendium Books, I found myself thinking in response to almost every page how much of these worlds I recognized from my own experience in India and Pakistan. In both places, Latin America and South Asia, there was and still is a conflict between the city and the village. And there are similarly profound gulfs between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, the great and the small. Both are places with powerful colonial histories, Different colonialists, same results. And in both places, religion is of great importance, and God is alive, and so, unfortunately, are the godly. All right. Kind of a slow burn there, but you got there. I knew Garcia Marquez's colonels and generals, or at least their Indian and Pakistani counterparts. His bishops were my mullahs, his market streets were my bazaars. His world felt to me like mine translated into Spanish. It's little wonder I fell in love with it, not for its magic, though as a writer reared on the fabulous wonder tales of the East, that was appealing too, but for its realism. Long before I ever visited Latin America, its writers had made me feel that it would be familiar. And when at last I did go, to Nicaragua first, and then Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, I thought, what do you know? These places are exactly as crazy as their writers told me they were. And they are crazy in the same way that my places are. They even have the same tropical vegetation, the same garish billboards and storefronts, the same sidewalk life, the same rich tradition of oral storytelling, the excess, the odors, the sensuality, the heat. Driving in Managua on my first ever day in the region, I found myself thinking, I know this place. And that was partly because of Garcia Marquez and his colleagues, and partly because our worlds were and are genuinely alike. Garcia Marquez himself always asserted the realism of his work rather than its fabulism. I invent nothing, he once told the BBC about his literary style. People always praise my imagination, but I believe I am a terrible realist. Everything I invent was already there in reality. The writer Daniel Alarcón told the BBC, a couple of years ago when I was in Cartagena, I was in a cab and the cabbie was like, this is Gabo's house. And he added, here in the Caribbean, we all have great stories. Gabo is just a good typist. We do not live in magical times. The world is dark, and literature responds to it with dystopias. Many of the most highly praised new fictions are remarkable for their bleakness. There is, it seems, little joy to be found. In literature, as in all things, fashion exists, and the current fashion is for a kind of writing that is almost the antithesis of Garcia Marquez. The vogue term for this new kind of work is autofiction, a literature that shies away from everything invented, that trusts only the deeply autobiographical, the nakedly personal. Nonfiction outsells fiction in the bookstores, and so fiction becomes non-fictional as well. It seems that for many readers, the imagination is a thing that must not be trusted. And so they turn towards the work, for example, of the French novelist Amélie Nothomb, or the pseudonymous Italian Elena Ferrante, or the Norwegian Carl Ove Knausgaard, the second author to call his book, slightly oddly, Mein Kampf, which is to say, Mein Kampf. It is not my purpose in this piece to criticize these writers in any way. I appreciate their talent, and it is plain that they have captured the rapt attention of many readers in many countries. And in many ways, it is a great thing to become unfashionable. It removes the work from the glare of the world's attention and allows it simply to be there, greeting what readers do come and waiting for the great wheel to turn, as it must, as it always does. There's no doubt that in Latin America and beyond Latin America too, the grand moment of magic realism has passed, and the new writers want to do almost anything but that kind of work. The most highly regarded writer of the generation after Garcia Marquez, the late Roberto Bolaño, notoriously declared that magic realism stinks, and jeered at Garcia Marquez's fame, calling him a man terribly pleased to have hobnobbed with so many presidents and archbishops. It was a childish outburst, but it showed that for many Latin American writers, the presence of the great colossus in their midst had become more than a little burdensome. With the great man's passing and the change in the literary wind, that burden has been lifted and it becomes possible to appreciate the oeuvre not just as the phenomenon it was, but as the work. It needs to be said clearly that while literary fashions come and go, and autofiction, with its rejection of the fictional, may well be no more than a current fashion, what in Latin America became known as magic realism is not a passing fad. It is a recent manifestation of what I think of as the other great tradition in world literature, the tradition which manifests itself in every language, in every age, and which is at least the equal of the realist tradition. Milan Kundera once wrote that the novel has two parents, Clarissa Harlowe and Tristram Shandy. And he argued that the realist tradition, which descended from Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, was, to paraphrase Kundera, exhausted by overuse, while the antic, ludic line that descends from Sterne was the tradition in which most fresh new work remained to be done. I might argue that Tristram Shandy owes an obvious debt to Cervantes. The characters of Uncle Toby and Corporal Trim being more or less directly drawn from Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. It might be better to say that the other great tradition is composed of the heirs of Don Quixote, but let's not quibble about parenthood. My point is that whatever local name and coloring this tradition acquires, whether it's French surrealism or American fabulism, these different bodies of work are all part of the same river. Kafka's dung beetle in the Metamorphosis, Bulgakov's devil making mayhem in the Moscow of the Master and Margarita, and Charles Dickens, too, flow alongside Garcia Marquez. The Circumlocution Office in Bleak House, a government department whose entire purpose is to do nothing, and the gigantic dust heaps in Our Mutual Friend, a city dwarfed by its mountains of its own garbage, are images which any self-respecting magic realist would be proud to have created. On my first readings of Garcia Marquez, the name that most often came to mind was that of Luis Buñuel, a surrealist whose masterpieces, such as The Exterminating Angel, come closer to the unique tone of Garcia Marquez than anyone else's. This other great tradition is inspired by the idea of the fictionality of fiction, its made-upness, an idea which unshackles literature from the confines of the naturalistic and allows it to approach the truth by wilder and perhaps more interesting routes. Garcia Marquez knew very well that he belonged to a far-flung literary family. William Kennedy quotes him saying, "In Mexico, surrealism runs through the streets." And again, the Latin American reality is totally Rabelaisian. There is a thing that Shakespeare knew, and before him Homer also knew. The world is not one thing, but many, not singular, but multiform, protean, not constant, but infinitely mutable. Hamlet is by turns a ghost story, a murder story, a love story, a tale of political intrigue, a saga of family betrayal. It's comedy and tragedy and history as well. And when Helen of Troy goes to see the wooden horse standing at the gates of the city and raises her hand to caress its belly, the men hidden inside are helplessly aroused, even though naturalism would decree that they couldn't even be aware of her presence, let alone feel its erotic power through the wood. One Greek is so violently excited that Odysseus has to strangle him lest he cry out and give the game away. The Buendia dynasty and the patriarch and the innocent Erendira and the sad colonel to whom nobody writes are the inheritors of this tradition, whose parents may be Cervantes or Shakespeare or Homer or all three. From this tradition come many of the most durable works ever created, including the work of Gabriel García Márquez, which will continue to endure while fashions come and go. I never met him, and I greatly regret that. But we did have one long conversation. I was in Mexico City at a friend's house, and Carlos Fuentes came to dinner. I told him I'd been disappointed to learn that García Márquez was out of town in Cuba visiting his friend Fidel. Fuentes said something like, "It's ridiculous that you two have never met." And shortly afterwards, he left the room for a few minutes, returning to summon me into another room where he handed me a telephone receiver. "There's somebody you have to talk to," he said, and left me alone with Gabo's voice in my ear. The conversation began awkwardly. He claimed not to know any English, but it quickly became clear that he knew plenty, but preferred not to speak it. My Spanish is very poor. I don't speak it at all, but I understand a little. And we both had some French. So we proceeded trilingually. And things got better. In fact, in my memory of the conversation, there is no language problem. In my memory, we're just talking to each other and understanding one another perfectly. It was quite a long conversation. We covered a lot of ground. I remember telling him that I'd read about his grandmother's stories and their importance in helping him to formulate his own, and I told him about the family stories my mother told me and their importance in my work. He was very kind about my writing. We talked about the differences between us, the difference between Macondo and Bombay, the village and the city. I told him that I had written about the Chronicle of a Death Foretold and also about his non-fiction work, Clandestine in Chile, in which he told the story of the filmmaker Miguel Litin making his secret film under the very dangerous nose of the tyrant Pinochet. And I noted that he responded with more enthusiasm to my interest in his journalism than in my review of his fiction. Once a journalist, always a journalist. He was interested in my own foray into reportage, my little book about Nicaragua during the Contra War. I told him the story of a dinner at the home of Daniel Ortega with almost all the Sandinista leadership present, during which I had been reluctant to produce a tape recorder or notebook, knowing it would change the nature of the dinner table conversation. Instead, I pretended to have a stomach upset and retreated every 10 or 15 minutes to the toilet, where I scribbled furiously in the notebook in my pocket, writing down dialogue and other observations. He found that amusing, and he told me, "You see, you are a reporter too." Many years later, when I became president of PEN American Center, I tried many times to get him to come to New York as our guest, and he always replied politely and declined. It was New York's loss and mine. I never met Borges either, but in my early 20s, I saw him lecture in London, and much later in Buenos Aires, thanks to the kindness of Maria Kodama, I met his library, which was almost as good. And though I never met García Márquez, I have the memory of our conversation, and I have, as we all have, his books, and they are more than enough. I offer my congratulations to the Ransom Center on acquiring this landmark archive, and my thanks for the invitation to speak here to celebrate the achievement of a giant of modern literature. The occasion of the arrival of his archive here in Austin is perhaps comparable to that fictional American acquisition of the Caribbean. You, too, have carried it off in numbered pieces. To plant it far from the hurricanes in the blood-red dawns of, in this case, Texas, not Arizona, with everything it had inside, with the reflection of our cities, our timid drowned people, our demented dragons. As that great sea of literature is transported to Austin, I would like to end by giving the last words to the creator of that sea, by reading the last sentences of 100 Years of Solitude, in which the last of all the Aurelianos is reading Melquiades' parchment, which contains the story of his family and of himself as well, and which are therefore the book we are reading as he reads it, and whose true author is the gypsy created by the author of the book. He was so absorbed that he did not feel the second surge of wind either, as its cyclonic strength tore the doors and windows off their hinges, pulled off the roof of the east wing, and uprooted the foundations. Only then did he discover that Amaranta Ursula was not his sister but his aunt, and that Sir Francis Drake had attacked Riohasha only so that they could seek each other through the most intricate labyrinths of blood until they would engender the mythological animals that would bring the line to an end. Macondo was already a fearful whirlwind of dust and rubble being spun about by the wrath of the biblical hurricane when Aureliano skipped 11 pages so as not to lose time with facts he knew only too well, and he began to decipher the instant he was living, deciphering it as he lived it, prophesying himself in the act of deciphering the last page of the parchments as if he were looking into a speaking mirror. Then he skipped again to anticipate the predictions and to ascertain the date and circumstances of his death. Before reaching the final line, however, he had already understood that he would never leave that room, for it was foreseen that the city of mirrors or mirages would be wiped out by the wind and exiled from the memory of men at the precise moment when Aureliano Babylonia would finish deciphering the parchments, and that everything written on them was unrepeatable since time immemorial and forevermore, because races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on earth. Thank you.